How confident are we that any of this can actually happen in 2025? We've just got to wait and see. But I would say that I think the prospects are better than they are worse, only because the Russians have been bled and their resources drained by 3 years of heroic Ukrainian defence. So I think Putin probably does want to weigh out or to move this into another stage. He wants that negotiation that he feels he was denied in December 2021. And Trump has staked his domestic political credibility and his ego on this outcome. And I think that's a particularly sizable, significant bet for him personally. He'll want to have something to say about it, I think, fairly soon. Putin can be sold the idea that he is now going to be heard over some of these issues, specifically on Ukraine not necessarily joining NATO, either in the immediate term or at all. And just to be very clear about that, that's because Donald Trump, in his Mar-a-Lago press conference from the start of 2025, actually again brought up this point about Russia's red line around Ukraine joining NATO. So it'd be very clear, Trump's been very public about this. It'd be very shocking if he wasn't then privately encouraging to Putin about this particular negotiation point. I think he can bring that to Putin. So Joe Biden and his administration never exhibited any enthusiasm for a negotiation with Russia at all. And everyone will have their own view over this, but we can only judge an administration by its policies and its outcomes. Something Donald Trump said at his Mar-a-Lago press conference, January 2025, so very recently, his words, not mine, even an average deal maker could have come to a deal with Russia over their invasion of Ukraine before it happened in December 2021. Trump's words. So one would assume Trump is being retrospective, and he can just put himself in the shoes of Joe Biden and say, well, I'd have done differently. Easy to say that now. Trump runs a very nationally focused, quite transactional approach to America's position in the world. Whereas I think the Joe Biden administration, in people like Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken and others, they channeled, I think, some of that probably kind of post-Cold War, 90s, early 2000s sense of America having a global moral responsibility for providing security to different parts of the world. It's now a big open question as to how Donald Trump interprets the use of America's military power and its prestige globally. I think at this stage, where there's been so much loss of life on the Russian and the Ukrainian side, so much resource has been expended by Russia, by Ukraine, but also by Ukraine's key allies, there's no good outcome. This is a war that's going to end in a very, very messy compromise. It will probably end, or at least come to a pause next year if Trump's plan actually comes to fruition, with a de facto partition of Ukraine, sadly. Not a de jure one. No one's going to recognise this internationally. But just to pick an example from Europe as it is today, Cyprus has been divided since 1974. There's no recognition of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. It can happen that there's an invasion, it takes a certain amount of territory. There's no resolution, there's no defeat or victory one way or the other. And the situation is then what it is. So who's to gain from it in the very immediate term? I think the Ukrainian people, no matter if this isn't a just outcome, the suffering that they're enduring, not only near the front lines in the south and the east of Ukraine, but also people who've lost family, loved ones, who've lost their livelihoods, people who are living in cities like Kyiv or Dnipro, where they're being bombed by Russian long-range rockets and missiles on a intermittent basis, and having to go to bomb shelters, having their lives disrupted like this. I think a stop to that disruption is going to be very, very welcome for Ukraine. It needs a moment of pause to be able to rebuild meaningfully, for people to process what's happened. I still think the Ukrainians have avoided a total collapse in their front line. But given the amount of resource, the amount of military power the Russians have and the superior numbers that they have, there's no chance the Ukrainians can keep them still. I think if they can avoid a collapse of the next few weeks, that in itself will be a really positive outcome for Ukraine. Just in terms of the fact Russians could have moved into Kharkiv, they could have moved into Odessa, they could have moved into Kyiv. That was a real fear in 2022, and it hasn't come to pass. And that is a tribute and a testimony to the fighting determination of the Ukrainians, and of course a tribute to the sacrifice of the Ukrainian people in preventing that territorial loss from being bigger than it already has been. An ongoing job for the Ukrainian president will be to not be reinvaded by the Russians. So I think probably the best case is, or the least worst case now, is that you have a stabilised front line. Ukraine will have a regrettable loss of some territory that it can control. It might still lay rhetorical claim to that territory, but it won't control that territory. And it will want to minimise the insecurity that it suffers across that divide. Now, the worst case, and this is the thing that people are presenting, and I think it is a threat, is that the Russians use an interregnum to rearm, regroup. God, maybe another iteration of another US president in 4 years from now, maybe Putin or Putin's successor sees another opportunity to go back in and to finish the job that they feel that they only half did with this invasion now.
Trump has an opportunity to go down in history as a savior of a big nation, because we're literally being exterminated.
Gorbachev was forced to flee her home in the Donetsk region a decade ago. That's after fighting erupted between the Ukrainian government and Russian-backed militias, and 2 subsequent internationally brokered peace deals, the Minsk Accords, collapsed. The 55-year-old hasn't ruled out abandoning her new home in Dnipro if the Russian army continues to creep towards the southeastern city.
He will not stop in Donetsk, Zaporizhia, or Dnipropetrovsk region. He will go further. At times, we even start asking, where will he go next? Baltic states? He will go there too. Who is to stop him?
Trump's advisors now concede the war will take months or even longer to resolve. That's a sharp reality check on his biggest foreign policy promise to strike a deal on his first day in office. Nevertheless, a recent poll by research company Greatest Research showed that a third of Ukrainians believe the war will end by the end of 2025, up from about a quarter 6 months earlier. Another third said they expected the war to go on for years, while a final third said it was too difficult to say. The negotiating positions of the 2 warring sides remain far apart. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pushing hard for an invitation to NATO as the best way of deterring future Russian aggression. Putin has said he is open to discussing a ceasefire deal with Trump. However, he's ruled out any major territorial concessions and insists Kyiv abandon its NATO ambitions.